The autumn air bit at James's cheeks, crisp and cold. He pulled his jacket tighter, the scent of damp earth and dry corn husks filling his lungs. As a botanist, late nights in the field weren't unusual, but tonight felt different. A thick fog was rolling in, swallowing the path ahead and clinging to the tall, brittle stalks of the cornfield he was cutting through. The harvest moon, usually a brilliant guide, was now just a hazy silver disk in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with the breeze. He quickened his pace, his boots crunching on fallen leaves. That's when he heard it. A soft rustling just behind him. It wasn't the wind. This was a deliberate sound, a dry, scraping noise, like something being dragged. He stopped, straining his ears. Silence. Just the gentle sigh of the wind through the corn. He told himself it was just a raccoon, or maybe a deer startled by his presence. He started walking again, a little faster this time. Crunch. Rustle. It was there again, mirroring his steps. He stopped. It stopped. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. He spun around, peering into the dense fog behind him. Nothing. Just endless rows of corn, their heads bowed as if in prayer. The path he just walked was already vanishing into the milky white haze. A prickle of unease ran down his spine. He wasn't alone. He started to jog, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The rustling behind him grew louder, faster, keeping perfect time with his frantic pace. It sounded heavier now, no longer a small animal, more like footsteps. Unsteady, dragging footsteps. He didn't dare look back. The path twisted and turned, a labyrinth of gold and brown. The cornstalks seemed to lean in, their leaves brushing against his face like skeletal fingers. Suddenly, a shadow darted across the path, just a few feet ahead of him. It was a fleeting shape, dark and impossibly fast, gone before his mind could even register what he'd seen. He skidded to a halt, his blood running cold. He was being herded, trapped. Panic seized him and he bolted, plunging blindly off the path and into the dense rows of corn. The stalks whipped at his face, their sharp leaves scratching his skin. He ran, disoriented, the fog disorienting him completely. Every direction looked the same. Paths he thought he remembered from his research just weren't there anymore. The field was shifting, rearranging itself around him. He felt like a rat in a maze, and the walls were closing in. Then came the whispers, soft, insidious, carried on the wind. Ya beings ... His own name, stretched and distorted, echoing from all around. It sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He clapped his hands over his ears, shaking his head. "It's not real," he muttered, his voice trembling. "It's just the wind." But the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "We see you. Ya, beings ... He stumbled through another row and saw a shape looming in the fog. A scarecrow. It was a familiar landmark, one he passed every day. Relief washed over him, a beacon in the madness. He scrambled toward it, thinking he could climb the post, get a vantage point, see a way out. As he got closer, he noticed something was wrong. Its button eyes weren't black and lifeless. They were glowing. A faint, pulsing, malevolent red. He froze, his hand outstretched. As he watched, horrified, the scarecrow's head tilted, just a fraction of an inch. A slow, creaking sound, like old wood straining. Its stitched smile seemed to widen in the dim moonlight. He backed away slowly, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The scarecrow was alive. A twig snapped directly behind him. He whirled around, a scream catching in his throat. The shadow was there, At the edge of the clearing, it was closer now. Much closer. It was vaguely human-shaped, but its proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. It didn't walk. It seemed to glide over the ground, a patch of pure darkness that absorbed the moonlight. He turned and ran again, not caring where he was going, only that he was getting away. He could hear it behind him, the dragging sound now accompanied by a wet, guttural clicking. Every time he risked a glance over his shoulder, the figure was closer. It was faster than him. Its form shifted as it moved, elongating and contracting like something not bound by the laws of physics. He burst out of the corn rows and onto the dirt path again, a different part of the field he didn't recognize. He ran, his lungs on fire, his legs screaming in protest. The clicking was right behind him now, so close he could feel the air stir. He could almost feel its cold breath on his neck. He didn't look back again. He just focused on the faint lights of his house, a distant promise of safety shimmering through the fog. He ran harder than he'd ever run in his life, fueled by pure, primal terror. The sounds faded as he burst from the edge of the cornfield and collapsed onto his own lawn, gasping for air. He lay there for a long time, his body shaking uncontrollably. When he finally dared to look back, the cornfield was silent. The fog was beginning to thin, and the harvest moon shone brightly on the still silent rows. There was nothing there. It was just a field. But as he stared, he could have sworn he saw one of the scarecrows, deep within the field, slowly turn its head to watch him go. He never went back to that cornfield again. In some nights, when the wind is just right, he can still hear the faint, dry whispers carrying his name from the darkness. In some nights, when the wind is just right, he can still hear the faint, dry whispers carrying his name from the darkness. October had always been Marcus's favorite month. He was a photographer, you see, obsessed with capturing that fleeting moment when autumn sets the world ablaze in gold and crimson. This year, he'd heard whispers of a place called Blackwood Orchard, an old forgotten apple grove just off a lonely highway, miles from anywhere. The locals said it was abandoned, left to the winds of nature for decades. For Marcus, that sounded like paradise. A place untouched, raw, and perfect for the shot that would define his career. He found it just as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. The entrance was marked by a rusted wrought iron gate hanging crookedly on a single hinge. A weathered sign, barely legible, read Blackwood Orchard. As he pushed the gate open, it let out a long, mournful groan that echoed through the trees. The air inside was immediately different, colder, heavier. A profound silence hung between the rows of gnarled apple trees, a silence so deep it felt like it was pressing in on him. Marcus pulled out his camera, a comforting weight in his hands. The scene was breathtaking. The leaves were a chaotic tapestry of red, yellow, and orange, and they carpeted the ground in a thick, soft layer. The apples, however, were what truly caught his eye. They were a deep, almost unnatural shade of crimson, glistening like polished stones in the dying light. They hung heavy on the branches, perfectly ripe, yet none seemed to have fallen. It was strange, but he dismissed it as a lucky find. He began walking, his boots crunching softly on the leaves. He framed his first shot, focusing on a gnarled branch laden with those perfect blood-red apples. But as he looked through the viewfinder, something was off. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, but the trees themselves didn't just sway. They seemed to groan, to twist, their branches contorting like arthritic fingers. It was an unsettling, almost living sound. He lowered his camera, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. It was probably just the wind, he told himself, playing tricks on him. He took a few steps deeper into the orchard, drawn by the promise of even more dramatic scenery. Suddenly, a single apple dropped from a branch just ahead of him. Thump. It landed softly on the leafy ground. But then, it began to roll. Not downhill, but straight toward him, stopping just a few feet away. Marcus stared at it, his brow furrowed. Before he could process it, another apple fell. Thump. And another. Thump. Thump. One by one, they dropped from the trees and rolled, not randomly, but in a deliberate path, leading him further and further away from the gate. A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air snaked down his spine. This was wrong. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to get in his car and drive away. But the photographer in him, the part that craved the extraordinary, was captivated. It was like the orchard was inviting him in, showing him a secret path. He hesitated, then, against his better judgment, he followed. With each step, the orchard grew denser, the canopy of leaves overhead thickening until the last rays of sunlight were choked out. The world became a gloom of shifting shadows and deep twilight. The temperature plummeted. The cheerful crunch of leaves under his feet was replaced by the sickening squelch of damp soil and rotting fruit. The air grew thick with the cloying, sweet smell of decay. The groaning of the trees became more pronounced, evolving into something that sounded disturbingly like whispers. He couldn't make out any words, just a sibilant, hissing chorus that seemed to come from all directions at once. He raised his camera again, trying to steady his shaking hands. He needed to document this. He focused on the trunk of a massive, ancient-looking tree, its bark twisted into grotesque patterns. But when he looked through the lens, the patterns resolved into something horrifying. Faces. Dozens of them, stretched and screaming in silent agony, their features contorted within the wood. He gasped and stumbled backward, dropping the camera. It landed with a soft thud on the damp earth. The whispers grew louder, mocking him. Panic finally seized him. He turned and ran, scrambling back the way he came. But the path was gone. The rows of trees, once orderly, were now a chaotic, impenetrable maze. He ran left, then right, but every path he took just seemed to loop back on itself, leading him deeper into the suffocating darkness. The orchard was a prison, and it was closing in. The branches of the trees, which had once looked merely old, now seemed to reach for him, their twigs like grasping, skeletal fingers snagging at his clothes, his hair. Exhausted and terrified, he stopped, gasping for breath. That's when he noticed the apples again. They were no longer just on the trees. Hundreds of them littered the ground, and they were moving. Slowly, deliberately, they rolled across the forest floor, converging on his position. They weren't guiding him anymore. They were hurting him. They formed a perfect circle around him, their polished red skins gleaming in the faint moonlight that managed to pierce the canopy. They looked like a circle of glowing, red eyes, all watching him. Then the ground beneath his feet began to shift. He looked down and screamed. Thin, pale, skeletal hands were erupting from the soil. They were bone-white, looking like twisted roots at first, but they had fingers, and they were reaching for him. One clamped around his ankle, its grip impossibly strong. Then another and another. They clawed at his legs, their bony fingers digging into his flesh, pulling him down. He fought, he kicked, he screamed, but it was useless. He was being dragged. His eyes, wide with terror, locked onto what they were dragging him toward. At the center of the circle of apples stood a colossal, ancient tree far larger than the others. Its trunk was hollowed out, forming a dark, gaping maw at its base, a perfect black hole in the fabric of the night. The whispering rose to a crescendo, a hungry, expectant roar that filled his head. This was the heart of the orchard. This was its mouth. The last thing Marcus saw was the blackness of that hollow rushing toward him, ready to swallow him whole. Then, as he was pulled into the suffocating dark, the orchard fell silent once more, waiting patiently for its next visitor. And somewhere on the damp ground, a forgotten camera lay still, its lens pointed toward an empty clearing. If you made it this far, thank you. Your next great story is next. The forest floor was a sea of gold and crimson, a perfect picture of autumn tranquility. This was exactly what Daniel needed. A writer, 32 years old, he had rented this remote, abandoned cabin deep in the woods, hoping the solitude would finally break his writer's block. He wanted to finish his novel, to lose himself in his own fictional world. But as the sun began to dip below the tree line, he'd soon discover he wasn't creating a story. He was living one, a chilling one. He was settling in, a fire crackling in the hearth when he first heard it. A soft, rustling sound from outside. He peered through the window. The wind was picking up, sending golden leaves into a frenzied dance. But then, mixed with the whisper of the leaves, he heard something else. Laughter. A light, almost childlike giggle carried on the wind. He scanned the clearing. Nothing, no one. Just the endless expanse of trees, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the twilight sky. He dismissed it as his imagination, the city dweller's mind playing tricks on him in the unfamiliar silence of the wild. Back inside, the cabin felt different, colder. He'd left the main room for only a moment, but now an unnerving stillness hung in the air. He noticed the sound of his own breathing seemed too loud. He approached the fireplace to add another log. The flames cast long, dancing shadows on the stone hearth. He froze. The ashes, which had been a scattered gray pile just minutes ago, were now arranged in a distinct shape. It was a crude, but unmistakable, outline of a human form, lying curled as if asleep in the cinders. He hadn't done that. He was sure of it. A knot of dread tightened in his stomach. How? A sudden sharp creak from across the room made him jump. The heavy wooden door, which he had bolted shut, was slowly swinging open. No wind pushed it. The air outside was perfectly still, yet a frigid draft swept into the cabin, extinguishing two of the candles on the mantel and making the fire sputter violently. The cold wasn't natural. It felt ancient, carrying a scent of damp earth and decay. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs. He slammed the door shut, his hand trembling as he fumbled with the iron bolt, sliding it back into place with a loud clang that echoed in the oppressive silence. He tried to rationalize. Old house, settling foundations, drafts. But the explanations felt hollow, thin defenses against the creeping fear that was all too real. He lit the extinguished candles again, their flickering light barely pushing back the encroaching darkness. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and writhe, no longer just absences of light, but things in and of themselves. They clung to the walls like ink spilled in water, twisting into grotesque shapes that his mind refused to fully process. He caught his reflection in the dusty mirror hanging over a small writing desk. For a split second, a figure stood behind him. Tall, gaunt, its features lost in the gloom. He spun around. Nothing, just the empty room, the flickering fire, and the oppressive silence. He turned back to the mirror, his own face pale and wide-eyed, staring back at him, alone. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, a physical pressure on the back of his neck. Driven by a desperate need for distraction, he started rummaging through the desk drawers, hoping to find something, anything, to ground him in reality. That's when he found it, tucked away beneath a pile of yellowed newspapers, an old leather-bound journal. The pages were brittle, the ink faded. It was a diary, kept by someone who had stayed in this very cabin decades ago. His hands shook as he read the spidery script. The entries started normally, describing the beauty of the autumn woods, but the tone quickly changed. The writer spoke of strange noises, of shadows that moved on their own, of a constant chilling presence. The final entry was written in a frantic, barely legible scrawl. It described a specific night, this very night of the year, when the veil between worlds thinned in this particular spot. The entry read, "The laughter is in the leaves. They are waiting. Anyone who stays in this cabin on this night never leaves." A cold sweat broke out across Daniel's forehead. He dropped the journal as if it had burned him. Suddenly, the cabin erupted in a cacophony of unseen activity. Drawers rattled violently in their frames. The few books on the shelf were swept to the floor by an invisible hand. A whisper, cold and sibilant, slithered directly into his ear, speaking his deepest fears aloud, articulating the very doubts about his life and his work that he'd come here to escape. The voice was his own, yet distorted, mocking. "Failure," it hissed. "Alone. No one will even know you're gone." Panic seized him. He scrambled for the door. His only thought to escape, to run into the cold, dark woods, anywhere but here. He fumbled with the bolt, his fingers numb and clumsy. But as his hand closed around the cold iron, the laughter started again. It wasn't outside anymore. It was inside the cabin with him. It was everywhere. It echoed from the rafters, rose from the floorboards, a chorus of mirthless, empty giggles. Then, with a deafening boom that shook the entire structure, the cabin door slammed shut, plunging the room into near total darkness as the force extinguished the fire and every last candle. He was trapped. Absolute blackness surrounded him, thick and suffocating. The laughter grew louder, more frantic, ringing in his ears. And through the grime-caked windows, he could see them. Vague, pale shapes gathering outside. Dozens of them. Their eyes, like faint, glowing embers in the night, were all fixed on him, watching. The forest was silent once more, save for the sound of laughter coming from inside the little abandoned cabin. Thank you for listening, my friends. Please like and subscribe.